So it's really fantastic to have Achim Steiner here. He's the head of the UN Development Programme, a very important UN agency in this whole story of climate change and its nexus with poverty and overcoming some of the great challenges we're facing in the world today. Achim, you're here in Baku on the Caspian Sea. And the atmosphere seems to be very positive in these corridors. I think some people before the conference felt, because of some political changes that we perhaps know in the world, that there might be a very depressive mood here, but far from it.
I would agree. I think the COP has gotten off to a very busy start, despite the usual kind of negotiations around the agenda. This is a working COP right now, and you can see it in the corridors, you can see it in the meeting rooms, in the committees. Essentially, the parties have gotten down to work, and there was also an early win, so to speak, with Article 6 and some of the decisions that have been a long time coming on how we will run the carbon markets in the future. So clearly, this is a COP that has the opportunity at this moment in time of, yes, a lot of disruption, a lot of economic stress in the world, and also new political developments on the other side of the Atlantic. Clearly, I think there is a determination to move forward, but there is also a degree of uncertainty that is now looming over this COP. And I think we should not underestimate the fact that this uncertainty is both of a political nature, but perhaps the more worrying part is, will it also slow down the scaling up of investments? Financial markets are fickle by nature, and they are watching right now what are the implications of some of the political signals that are shifting. And I think nothing could be more helpful than a strong, clear and unequivocal signal on the financing question that is so central here in Baku, to countries across the world, to the developing world, but also to the financial markets, to business and entrepreneurs who need to make very long-term decisions right now.
One of the main roles, I suppose, in the climate process for the UN Development Programme is to assist developing countries in forging their what they call nationally determined contributions, national climate action plans, which began with the Paris Agreement and then ratcheted up over time. That was the plan. We're in that process right now. The next ratcheting, it sounds quite painful, but we're in that process right now. We're hoping, of course, that this will be completed well before and certainly by Brazil next year when they host the next UN climate conference, COP30. How many countries are you assisting, and how is it going at the moment?
Well, let me first remind those who sometimes think an NDC is just a document. Actually, it was a brilliant answer and solution to a major dilemma in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was negotiated. Namely, the ability of where countries could commit to act was so far from where the science was telling us we needed to be, that the only way that the Paris Agreement could remain credible was to create this ratcheting up mechanism. So every 5 years, countries continue to increase their levels of ambition. And remarkably, we are now in the NDC 3.0 round, and it is working. People often forget that before Paris, we were on track to a 4-degree plus world. Just with the NDCs since then, in Paris, they were still very raw products. Then in Glasgow, NDC second generation. We essentially were close to bringing down the global warming pathway to maybe 2.63 degrees. So some dismiss this because it's obviously not enough, but let's think ahead another 10 years. Can we, by 2035, make this next generation of NDCs, which are essentially national climate and development strategies, really more ambitious? And for UNDP, for the UN system, the Secretary General, these are also the focus of our support to countries, because they are expressions of national sovereignty. They are the foundation which countries can assess their options for acting, but also to say to the world, and with additional support from other parts of the world, namely what is being negotiated here, the financing side, we could do even more, even faster. And in that sense, for us today, we have a climate promise that we have made, which is for up to 125 developing countries. UNDP, together with the UN sister agencies and development system, is able and willing and ready to offer support. And right now we are already engaged with, I think, close to 90 countries. We expect that to go well over 100. And the experience leading up to Glasgow was such a positive one, because for many countries it's also an opportunity to quickly learn from what are other countries doing, what worked in a country that is comparable to mine, what is the policy, the legislation, the degree of ambition we can afford. And I think what is also very encouraging, you have seen here in Baku, the Troika, Azerbaijan, the United Arab Emirates and Brazil coming forward with their NDCs. Now, they have only just been presented, or some of them not yet presented and released, but we have seen, for example, from Brazil, a remarkable set of raising ambition levels and commitments as the country that will host the next COP. A leading developing economy sending a signal that the future is in this transition and transformation. And actually, increasingly, it is developing countries who are now leading the frontier of change and transformation. That was not the case 10, 15 years ago.
We had a good boost from a developed country just the other day, and I think it was formalized yesterday with the UK committing an 80% emission reduction target. So, I mean, hand in hand, you know, rich
Can we
and
talk
poor.
about that for a moment? Because I think that's the other thing that has happened over the last 10 years. And, you know, we often produce these reports before these conferences take place and essentially focus on how much distance we have not covered, or how much further we have to go, and how much more quickly. What we underestimate is that these COPs that are so often maligned and everything is too slow, which is true, nevertheless they are producing the only solid foundation on which the world family of nations is actually moving forward. We are now seeing in Latin America 60% of all electricity consumed is renewable. We are seeing a transition in economies from Uruguay to Kenya to Albania to Denmark, all the way back to China, where the percentage of electricity that is now produced with renewable energy resource, no longer with fossil fuels, is growing exponentially to the point where Uruguay, Kenya and others are at 90% of their electricity being produced with renewables. In Europe, in the EU context, a legislative step that by 2040 Europe will have reduced its emissions footprint by 90%. And then the UK coming with an NDC here, essentially bringing Britain back into the leadership role that it had claimed and also displayed in Glasgow as the COP host. I think the Prime Minister, in what he brought to Baku and what he presented as the level of ambition right now, is exactly the signal that we need to send. The industrialized countries have ratcheted up their levels of ambition. They're investing hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, what is often not recognized is that developing countries are equally investing hundreds of billions of dollars a year in climate action. Perhaps we need to begin to recognize that everybody is investing, but what is being discussed here in Baku is, can the industrialized nations also add some more fuel, so to speak, to the ability of developing countries to move faster, and thereby the climate finance we are negotiating here becomes a multiplier and not a chessboard on which one side is trying to beat the other one as if we are bargaining over you know, a particular commodity. What we are trying to find out is, can we mobilize public and private sector resources in a way that could quadruple, quintuple or multiply by 10 times what countries are spending of their own taxpayers' money already in these transitions. And that is what is going to make the difference, whether the next NDCs can come close to 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, because NDCs without finance are an aspiration, aren't they? But as you rightly point out, there is money moving. And of course, if you said 10 or 15 years ago that the world was spending an estimated 1.2 trillion in climate finance flows, I think the people that do this have got better at calculating it, you would have gone, well, that sounds pretty good. But the gap, and you mentioned 10 times, which is kind of interesting, because the Climate Policy Initiative out of the UK, but many other places around the world, I think they feed a lot of the climate finance assessments with their data. And their estimate is that we need maybe between 10 and 12 trillion by 2030 to really set the stage for a net zero 2050. Still, too much of the flow is within the richer countries. But I suppose the question is, where do we go with finance from here? So, as you say, it is growing, and developing countries themselves are spending their money on climate action and climate flows. How do we unlock even bigger amounts of cash basically needed to meet the 1.5 or keep it alive? Let's not keep it alive, let's just meet it and hit the net zero in 2050.
First of all, I think by demystifying these extraordinary numbers, I mean, we are talking trillions now, and you know, people suddenly say, oh, it's 2 trillion, it's 3 trillion, maybe it's 12 trillion. I think we have to take a small step back and say, look, none of us know exactly what the volume of finance will be that is needed. It depends on how many countries are able to mobilize private sector investment, how many need perhaps public finance, concessional finance to create the conditions. If a small island nation today were to switch over to electric mobility, it simply cannot finance the initial infrastructure that would be needed. But it would actually save a lot of money in terms of mobility costs if it were to switch to an electric platform. So why does the world find it so difficult to help the 30, 40 small island developing nations to pivot to 100% not only clean and renewable electricity production, but actually also mobility? You don't run out of electricity on an island in terms of driving your car. So these are small examples that are not necessarily material to the larger emissions metric, but they keep a global family of nations together and moving forward together. Let me also say, people need to put things in perspective. 1.3 trillion is the number that the G77 plus China has brought to the table here as its expectation on a new collective quantified goal for climate financing. Now, to most people, that number seems, astronomical. Two facts. The IEA estimates that this year alone, the world will invest over $3 trillion in new energy infrastructure. Fascinating. 2 trillion of those 3 trillion will actually be in renewable energy infrastructure. So we're talking about $3 trillion energy infrastructure market per annum. If you project into that 1.3 trillion of public and private finance, it doesn't seem so strange anymore to talk in those terms. What is scaring people is that, we barely managed, if at all, to reach the $100 billion of climate finance. How on earth will we ever be able to move to 1.3 trillion in these economically challenging times? Well, I think I would ask the question in a different way. How much is it worth investing now together in order to avoid the kind of crisis that we know is unaffordable, non-financeable and catastrophic? Secondly, if we're able to spend $2,400 billion a year right now on defense expenditures and armies, how do we rationalize not finding maybe 100, 150 or $200 billion together to invest in the greatest risk to humankind in the 21st century? So we need to reframe this debate and, most importantly, get away from this notion that the developing world is asking the taxpayer of the developed world to pay for its development. Again, the developing world is already investing multiples in hundreds of billions of dollars in climate action, climate transition, compared to the $100 billion that the wealthiest nations have put on the table. We are haggling over the wrong numbers, and we need to, in my mind, move forward with a mindset that is about co-investment, and with that co-investment we multiply many-fold the investments that people are ready to make, whether governments through their public budgets in the developing world, or, as is already the case today, the private sector, the entrepreneurs, the financial markets.
I'm so glad you so eloquently phrased that, because, in fact, it's absolutely true. And all the economic studies, going back donkey's years, have shown that actually it's going to be more expensive to deal with uncontrolled climate change than any investments you would ever have
Lord
to make.
Nicholas Stern, the cost of inaction.
Yeah,
it's grown
Fresh.
exponentially.
Yeah, it's actually grown exponentially. Yeah, and exactly. And the Climate Policy Initiative out of London, which I mentioned before, even their assessments say, actually, just step back and echoing what you said, they sound like big numbers, but the world is actually investing very similar numbers anyway in infrastructure. Why not just make it green, which is maybe just a marginal little bit of an extra cost, which pays back so well over time?
Add to that, every dollar invested in renewable energy infrastructure creates 2 to 3 times more jobs than in traditional fossil fuel-based infrastructure. The economic multipliers, both in terms of how we avoid enormous losses in GDP, which again, Lord Nicholas Stern and others have provided us with very clear insights now of what it would mean to not act. But secondly, on the positive win-win and co-benefits of investing in these energy transitions. And again, if you take a small island developing nation, it on average pays 300 to 400% more for a kilowatt hour of electricity because it has to import the diesel to run the generators. So we could make access to affordable and clean energy a driver for development, not only on small island developing states, but for the 600 million people on the African continent who don't have access to electricity today. These are the positive economic multipliers.
Absolutely. Let's just come to a final topic. So there's a big push here by the US and China and others to have the national climate plans, NDCs, include all gases. So And these are some gases which some of our viewers may never have heard of, but we have to mention them anyway. Tropospheric ozone, nitrous oxides.
Trust you to know them all, Nick.
No, I've been staying up late at night revising this. Yeah.
Yes.
But
No,
I haven't
very
passed
good.
yet. I haven't got them all yet. There's a missing one. I'm missing one. Methane, of course, which comes from the oil and gas industry and agriculture. And there's a kind of momentum here that perhaps if they were in the NDCs, there'd be more focus on them because they only attract about 2% of climate finance, but yet they're superheating, but most of them just live for a very short length of time. So if you stopped sending them out, you might get a real benefit in terms of keeping within the temperature limits of the Paris Agreement, keeping the 1.5 degrees centigrade not breached. We have a little campaign called Buy More Time. I don't expect you to be aware of it, but do you think that's a good idea to make sure the NDCs cover all the forces of climate change, not just the CO2, but everything's in there, sort of thing?
Unquestionably so, and
Yeah.
I would say, why would a country not want to include all the actions it is either already taking or could take to reduce its emission footprint? In that sense, what an NDC that would include all these gases would do is actually give more visible expression and transparency to the contribution that a country is making globally to addressing this. And let's take methane or gas flaring from oil and gas exploration. In today's world, this is actually not only a major problem for the atmosphere, for climate change, it's also an economically ridiculous waste of resources. So again, what we need here is policy and regulatory frameworks that create the incentives to address the emission of those
Yes.
gases, or in a sense to then address the reduction of
Yes.
those gases
Yes.
in terms of their impact.
Yeah.
We often forget that our fossil fuel-based economy is still being subsidized to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money every year. And if you take the IMF calculations, they actually put the total cost and impact on our economies at, I think, close to $7 trillion as a result of essentially subsidies taking us in the wrong direction. Now imagine if we could just move 10 or 15% of those subsidies towards addressing the reduction or the elimination of the emission of those supercharged gases. It would be another way of, let's say, first of all, recognizing the efforts countries can make. Secondly, enabling them to be a proactive player in the global effort to address climate change. So NDCs are not a negotiated document. They are a country's sovereign expression of, first of all, how it views the issue of climate change. Secondly, how it translates that into its own ability to address it. And thirdly, what it is able to contribute to a global collective effort negotiated annually through these COPs in order to help the world get back on a 1.5 degree path.
Yeah.
And being able to also articulate what is the financing, domestically, internationally, private, public, that is needed to get to the level of ambition that we know next year in Belém at COP30 in Brazil. We have to demonstrate that the ratcheting up those levels of ambition are actually both real and feasible and implementable. And I think that is why broadening the net with which we look at each country's footprint, but also its ability to act, makes absolute sense.
Yeah. Finally, just a very small thing. I thought it might be worth just mentioning this, that, people come and go, and people have been in the process a long time, and then they pass on, and it goes to a new generation. And this year we lost, I think, one of the good thinkers and good political thinkers on climate change and environmental issues generally, and a good friend of the developing world too, which was the former German environment minister Klaus Topfer, and a predecessor of you as the executive director of UNEP when he was there, and then you followed him before you went to UNDP. Do you have a few words to say about Klaus Topfer?
How much time have we got?
Yeah.
No, thank you, Nick, for mentioning Klaus Töpfer. I think he embodied, first of all, a generation of leaders in politics who not only recognized the significance of environmental change, he also embraced it as a responsibility to act on it. It's not easy being a politician, especially 20, 25, 30 years ago, and to be an environment minister and to, really challenge industry, political parties, society, consumers with the science and the knowledge that was beginning to tell us at the time, Houston, we have a problem. Klaus Töpfer was not only brave, visionary, courageous, he was also inspirational. many will remember in Germany that when he thought he had been part of cleaning up the River Rhine, he actually put on a very strange diving suit at the time and a swimming cap and jumped into the River Rhine to
Yep.
say, this is what you can do when you put your mind to it. This
Mhm.
river is coming back alive.
Mm.
But he also led UNEP at a time when climate change had become a recognized threat, but ultimately also a divisive issue between developed and developing countries. I think he, again, was one of the pioneers who managed to bring climate change, environment, development, and ultimately an age of responsibility in addressing these issues together. And I think the legacies that he has left, both in terms of people, including us, institutions, laws, and pioneering innovations, I think are testimony to a
Yep.
life well lived. And we have lost quite a number of colleagues like this
Yes.
in the last few years. They are, in a sense, a generation on whose shoulders we stand now.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for being with us, Achim. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you very much for running UNDP, a very important part of the UN system. And let's keep our fingers crossed for Brazil next year.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Brazil will
thank
be
you.
a great host for the
Well,
COP.
you're
So
partly Brazil as well, so therefore you'll have a good
looking
time.
forward to it. Thank you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you
Cheers.
so much.
Okay.
Lovely to see you.
Thanks.
Thank you.